Henry Thompson thought he had seen everything, until a little boy walked into his life holding a necklace he hadn't seen in 6 years. The restaurant was alive with the low hum of voices, the clink of silverware, and the faint scent of rosemary and lemon drifting from the kitchen. Henry Thompson sat at a table near the window, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, his posture composed, his tone sharp as he discussed the final terms of an international real estate deal. His brown hair was neatly styled, his blue eyes focused, yet cold. Every movement he made was deliberate, efficient, practiced. He was a man who owned time, or at least acted like it. Waiters gave him space, business partners deferred to him, and no one ever approached him uninvited, until that moment. A soft, uncertain voice broke through the polished rhythm of the room. "Excuse me, sir, would you like to buy this?" The words came from a boy no older than 6, barefoot and clearly out of place in a high-end establishment. His blonde hair was tousled by the wind, his t-shirt was faded and one size too small, and hanging from his hand was a delicate heart-shaped pendant attached to a thin silver chain. The boy held it out as if offering something sacred. Henry barely registered the boy at first. He was mid-sentence, describing a projected return on investment, when the small voice halted his thoughts like a brick wall. He turned, irritated more by the interruption than curious about the child. But the moment his eyes landed on the pendant, everything stopped. His breath caught. His words evaporated. The pendant was unmistakable, elegant, simple, engraved with initials he hadn't seen in over 6 years. He had given it to Sophie. The room blurred at the edges as Henry reached out slowly and took the necklace from the boy's hand. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low and strained. The boy blinked up at him with wide, painfully familiar blue eyes and answered, "It was my mom's. She gave it to me before she got sick. She said to keep it safe." Henry didn't realize his hands were shaking until he tried to fasten the clasp and failed. His business partners sat in stunned silence. No one knew what to say. Without another word, Henry stood from the table and motioned for the boy to sit in the empty chair beside him. The child hesitated, uncertain, but obeyed. Henry turned to his confused companions and said, "We're done here," then signaled the waiter. He didn't care about the deal anymore. The numbers, the projections, even the handshake that had seemed vital 5 minutes ago meant nothing now. He focused on the boy again, noticing now how thin he was, how his small hands clutched the strap of a worn backpack. The pendant still rested on the table between them. Henry couldn't look away from it. That necklace had been the last thing he'd given Sophie before she vanished from his life without explanation. And now, here it was, held by a little boy with her eyes and a voice that hit too close to his heart. "What's your name?" Henry asked, already dreading the answer. "Lucas," the boy replied. Henry felt the ground shift beneath him. He didn't ask more, not yet. But in that moment, with the necklace in front of him and the boy sitting quietly across the table, he already knew. He was staring at his son. Henry led Lucas out of the restaurant through a side entrance, away from the watchful stares and curious murmurs that had begun to ripple through the dining room. The boy followed him without hesitation, clutching the strap of his worn backpack and occasionally glancing down at the necklace now resting in Henry's hand. Outside, the city was buzzing with afternoon traffic and noise, but Henry's mind was silent, consumed by a storm of memories and emotions he hadn't let himself feel in years. He didn't speak until they reached his car, a sleek black sedan parked by the curb. He opened the passenger door and knelt down to meet Lucas's eyes. "Would you like to come with me for a while?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the chaos inside. Lucas nodded once, then climbed in and buckled his seatbelt like it was second nature. The ride was quiet. Henry kept glancing at him through the mirror, comparing the curve of his nose, the arch of his brow, the way his lips pressed together when he was nervous. It was all too familiar. He could see Sophie in the boy's face, but even more unnervingly, he saw himself. Every few minutes, Lucas would glance out the window, eyes scanning the world as if he was looking for a reason to believe what was happening. Henry wanted to ask questions, Where had he been living? How had Sophie died? Why hadn't anyone told him? But he held back. Not yet. The boy looked too fragile, and Henry didn't want to break the only thread of trust forming between them. When they arrived at Henry's apartment building, the doorman barely had time to greet him before he ushered Lucas inside. The lobby, all marble floors and polished glass, seemed too cold and formal for a child. Lucas stood close to him, taking in everything with the quiet alertness of someone who'd learned to always pay attention. Inside the penthouse, the contrast was even sharper. Sleek furniture, minimal decor, and a panoramic view of the city made the space look more like a showroom than a home. Lucas didn't say a word. He didn't take off his backpack or sit down. He just stood near the doorway, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to be there. Henry gently took the backpack from his shoulder and set it on the couch. "You're safe here," he said, and motioned to the armchair. Lucas sat slowly, still watching him closely. Henry walked into the kitchen and returned with a glass of water and a plate with some crackers, not sure what else a 6-year-old would eat. Lucas thanked him so quietly that Henry almost didn't hear it. They sat across from each other, the silence stretching. Finally, Henry asked, "Do you know who I am?" Lucas looked at him, confused, then shook his head. "No. But you look like me," he said. The honesty of it hit Henry like a wave. He cleared his throat and tried to steady his voice. "I think I might be your father." Lucas didn't react at first. He just blinked, like he was processing a word he'd heard but never truly understood. After a moment, he asked, "Did you know my mom?" Henry nodded. "I did. A long time ago." Lucas's voice was smaller when he said, "She got sick. She tried to keep working, but then she couldn't anymore. One day, she just didn't wake up." He said it like he'd already explained it a dozen times. Matter of fact. Emotion tucked away so deep it barely surfaced. Henry didn't know what to say. He leaned forward and said quietly, "I'm so sorry, Lucas." The boy nodded but didn't cry. He seemed used to being the one who comforted others, even when he was the one hurting. Henry realized then that this boy had carried too much alone. He didn't know how much time had been lost, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he wasn't going to lose any more of it. That night, as Lucas curled up on the guest bed with the necklace still clutched in his hand, Henry stood outside the door watching him sleep. His mind was full of questions, of guilt, of all the moments he'd missed, but beneath it all was something clearer and quieter. For the first time in years, Henry Thompson felt sure about what he had to do. The next morning, Henry woke earlier than usual. He sat at the edge of his bed, staring out the tall windows as the city stirred beneath a pale sky. Normally, his days began with a schedule, a checklist, a race against time. But today, everything was still. For the first time in a long while, he had something far more important than meetings or contracts. He walked quietly down the hallway, unsure if Lucas would still be asleep. When he opened the guest room door, he found the boy curled up under the blanket, his small frame barely making a dent in the mattress. The heart-shaped pendant lay on the pillow beside him, one tiny hand resting close to it. Henry stood there for a moment, just watching, feeling the strange, warm ache of something he couldn't name. He went to the kitchen and started breakfast: scrambled eggs, toast, and fruit. Cooking wasn't something he did often, but he wanted to try. By the time the food was ready, Lucas had wandered into the living room, rubbing his eyes and blinking at the light. He looked at Henry, unsure, and Henry smiled and said softly, "Good morning. I made breakfast. If you're hungry." Lucas nodded, still not speaking much, and took a seat at the counter. He picked at the toast slowly at first, but after the first few bites, his pace quickened. Henry didn't ask questions right away. He just watched the boy eat, memorizing every detail: the way he held the fork, the small scar near his eyebrow, the faint shadows under his eyes. After breakfast, they sat on the couch, and Henry finally opened his laptop. "I want to show you something," he said. He brought up a photo, one from years ago, of him and Sophie at a company event, her smile radiant, his arm around her. Lucas leaned closer. His eyes widened. "That's my mom," he whispered. "And that's you?" Henry nodded. "Yes. We were together before you were born. I didn't know about you. I wish I had." Lucas stared at the screen for a long time. "She never talked about you," he said quietly. "But sometimes when she thought I was asleep, she'd look at that necklace and cry." The weight of that truth settled over them both. Henry closed the laptop and looked at the boy beside him. "She was very special. And so are you." Lucas didn't reply, but after a few seconds, he leaned against Henry's side. It was small, almost hesitant, but it was more than Henry expected. He placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder, and they sat like that for a while, neither needing to speak. Later that afternoon, Henry took Lucas out shopping. Not for toys or distractions, but for essentials. Clothes that fit, shoes that weren't worn through, a proper coat. At first, Lucas was overwhelmed by the attention. He hesitated every time Henry offered him a choice, as if he was afraid of choosing wrong. But Henry was patient, guiding him, never rushing. Eventually, Lucas began to open up a little, pointing at colors he liked, choosing a backpack shaped like a bear. At the register, Henry paid without blinking. For the first time in years, he felt that money had a purpose beyond profit. They returned home with bags in hand, and Lucas immediately unpacked everything and began organizing his new things. He didn't say much, but the way he handled the clothes, folded the shirts, and placed the shoes side by side, it spoke volumes. He was trying to make a space his own, even if part of him still doubted he could stay. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Henry brought out a small photo frame and placed the picture of Sophie and him on the shelf beside the guest bed. Lucas noticed but said nothing. At bedtime, Henry knelt beside him and tucked the blanket around his shoulders. "If you need anything," he said, "I'll be right down the hall." Lucas looked up at him and asked softly, "Are you really my dad?" Henry didn't hesitate. "Yes. And I want to be, if you'll let me." Lucas thought for a long moment, then gave a single nod. "Okay." It was just one word, but it held a world of meaning. Henry turned off the light and closed the door halfway, his heart full and aching. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The next few days unfolded with a strange sense of calm. Henry adapted quickly to the presence of a child in his home, though he still caught himself pausing in the hallway, listening for sounds that had never existed there before, bare feet padding on wood floors, the clink of a spoon in a cereal bowl, the quiet rustling of pages turning as Lucas read a picture book. It was unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Henry's apartment, once pristine and silent, had taken on a new life. There were markers scattered on the coffee table, tiny socks left near the sofa, and the occasional soft hum of a child's voice drifting from the guest room. These signs of life didn't irritate him as he might have expected. They grounded him. He rearranged his schedule to stay close. For the first time in years, he declined meetings that required travel, postponed non-essential briefings, and turned down a seat at a major conference. His assistant was baffled at first but soon understood something had shifted. Henry didn't offer explanations. He simply sent a firm directive: no interruptions unless urgent. Every morning, he helped Lucas get dressed. Every evening, he made sure there was dinner on the table, even if it was just takeout. At night, they read together. Lucas rarely asked for anything, and that troubled Henry more than if the boy had thrown tantrums or made demands. He had the quiet endurance of someone who had grown used to being overlooked. One afternoon, while Lucas napped on the couch with a blanket around his shoulders, Henry stood in the doorway and called his attorney. He wanted to move forward with legal guardianship, immediately. The process would take time, but the lawyer assured him that it was possible, especially with the DNA test results and the fact that Lucas had no surviving relatives willing or able to take custody. Still, the court would require more than proof of blood. They'd want to know if Henry was emotionally prepared, financially stable, and committed. He answered every question with calm resolve. For once, his wealth was useful for something that wasn't about profit. When Lucas woke up later that evening, Henry asked if he'd like to visit somewhere special the next day. Lucas looked up, confused. Like where? Henry smiled and said, the park. Or maybe a bookstore. Anywhere you want. The boy shrugged, uncertain, then whispered, can we go where there's water? Henry thought for a moment. There's a lake not far. We'll go there. It wasn't much, but it felt like a beginning. The next morning, they packed a small bag with snacks and drove to the lake. Lucas was quiet at first, holding Henry's hand tightly as they walked along the edge. Then, as if something in the breeze loosened a knot inside him, he started talking, about a duck he used to feed with his mom, about how she once told him the water could keep secrets if you whispered them just right. Henry listened without interrupting, grateful for every word. They sat together on a bench, watching the sun ripple over the surface. Lucas leaned against him and said, she said one day someone would find me. That I wouldn't be alone forever. Henry didn't speak right away. He looked out over the lake, his throat tight. She was right, he finally said. You're not alone now. That night, after they returned home, Lucas placed the pendant on his nightstand instead of clutching it like before. Henry noticed the difference. Trust, he realized, didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in small gestures, in tiny shifts of comfort. And every one of them mattered. As Lucas drifted off to sleep, Henry sat nearby in the dim light, watching his chest rise and fall. He had spent his life chasing power, security, control. But in that moment, all he wanted was to protect this one small, sleeping boy, and to never let him feel lost again. A week had passed since Lucas had entered Henry's life, but already it felt like time had shifted around them. Henry began to notice the subtle but powerful way his routines had transformed. Where mornings once began with headlines and investor calls, they now started with the sound of small footsteps crossing the hall, the clink of a cereal bowl, and the quiet voice of a boy trying to read aloud with concentration and heart. Henry didn't rush anymore. He still checked his phone, still reviewed contracts, but not before helping Lucas tie his shoes or making sure his backpack was ready. He found himself watching the child more than his screens, measuring progress in smiles rather than numbers. On Thursday morning, they had an appointment with a family therapist, something Henry had scheduled reluctantly, unsure whether it was necessary, but encouraged by his lawyer as part of the guardianship process. The office was warm and decorated with soft colors and child-friendly drawings. Lucas was nervous at first, his small hands clenched in his lap, eyes scanning the corners of the room. Henry sat beside him and gave his shoulder a light squeeze. When the therapist introduced herself and asked Lucas if he liked to draw, he nodded. Within minutes, he was coloring at the small table while she gently asked about his mom, the places he remembered, and what made him feel safe. Henry listened, silent and still, as Lucas answered in simple, honest words. My mom was kind. She got tired near the end. I used to bring her tea even though I'm not allowed to use the stove. Then she didn't wake up. Henry fought the tightening in his chest, struggling not to interrupt. It was the first time he had heard the story told out loud by Lucas himself, and it hit him harder than anything he'd expected. The therapist nodded with soft understanding and glanced at Henry. Do you feel safe with him now? She asked. Lucas looked up from his drawing, paused, then said, he makes me toast how I like it. And he listens. I think he wants me to stay. Henry swallowed hard and finally spoke. I do. More than anything. That evening, back home, Henry received a package he hadn't expected. It was a small cardboard box delivered by a courier. Inside were a few items from Sophie's personal belongings, recovered from the facility where she had spent her final weeks. There wasn't much: a hairbrush, a folded letter, and an old, worn photo of her holding Lucas as a baby. The photo shook Henry more than he could say. She looked tired but happy, her eyes filled with love as she held her son close. He realized he had missed not only the birth but every first step, every lullaby, every scraped knee that should have been his to comfort. He carried the photo into the living room and showed it to Lucas. The boy studied it and smiled faintly. "That's me. She used to hum to me like this," he said, mimicking a soft tune. Henry asked gently, "Do you want to keep it in your room?" Lucas nodded and held the photo close, as if afraid it would vanish. That night, they placed it beside the pendant on his nightstand. Before bed, Henry tucked him in, as usual, but tonight Lucas reached up and wrapped his arms around Henry's neck in a full hug, not rushed, not uncertain. "I'm glad I found you," he whispered. Henry closed his eyes and whispered back, "Me too." When Lucas had fallen asleep, Henry stayed in the doorway a long time. The guardianship hearing was drawing closer, and he knew the outcome was still not guaranteed. But the bond between them was real. It wasn't built on DNA or signatures or court decisions. It was built on early mornings, late-night stories, warm food, shared silence, and growing trust. He no longer saw Lucas as a responsibility. He saw him as his son. And he would fight for him, not because the law said he could, but because love said he must. The morning of the guardianship hearing arrived with a kind of nervous stillness that settled over Henry like fog. He woke early, not because he needed to, but because he couldn't sleep. The city outside his window was just beginning to stretch awake, streaks of gold cutting through the blue-gray sky. He moved through his apartment quietly, trying not to disturb Lucas, but the boy was already up, sitting on the floor with a coloring book and markers spread around him like petals. He looked up with wide, steady eyes and asked, "Is it today?" Henry nodded, then crouched beside him and said, "Yes. But you don't have to be scared. We're going to do this together." Lucas gave a small smile, then held up his drawing, a picture of a tall man with a briefcase holding hands with a little boy. Above it, in crooked letters, he had written one word: family. Henry dressed him carefully, helping him button a new shirt and comb through his blonde hair with soft, patient hands. He wasn't used to this kind of intimacy, but it came easier than he expected. For himself, he chose a suit more understated than usual. He didn't want to look like the powerful man he had built his image around. He wanted to look like someone who could be trusted to raise a child. On the drive to the courthouse, Lucas stayed quiet, staring out the window with a pensive expression. Henry reached across the console and gently squeezed his hand. "Whatever happens in there, I want you to know that I will always be here for you." The courthouse was a looming, stone building, with cold walls and long hallways that echoed every footstep. They were met by Henry's attorney in the lobby, a woman named Claire who spoke to Lucas with a warmth that surprised him. She explained in simple terms what would happen inside. Lucas nodded, but Henry could feel the small hand in his tighten as they approached the courtroom doors. Inside, the space was quiet and formal. A judge sat at the front, glasses perched low on his nose, reviewing documents with a furrowed brow. A child services representative sat near the front, clipboard in hand. The judge looked up and asked Henry to take the stand. Henry stood straight but spoke from the heart. He told the court about Sophie, how he had loved her, how they had lost touch, and how he hadn't known she was pregnant. He admitted his guilt, not in a way that excused anything, but in a way that acknowledged responsibility. He explained how Lucas came into his life not as an obligation, but as a gift. He spoke of the routines they had built, the nights reading books together, the silent strength of a boy who had lost too much and yet still found the courage to trust. "I'm not asking to be a guardian out of duty," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm asking because I love him. Because I want to raise him. Because I want him to have a home." Then the judge asked if Lucas wanted to say anything. The courtroom was silent as the boy walked slowly to the stand, the heart-shaped pendant swinging lightly against his chest. He looked so small against the backdrop of the law, but when he spoke, his voice was clear. He didn't know I was his kid. But when he found out, he stayed. He didn't have to. But he did. He paused and looked over at Henry. He's my dad now. I don't want to go anywhere else. The judge sat back, considering the words. Then he asked one final question, do you feel safe with him? Lucas nodded. Yes. He makes me feel like I matter. The ruling came an hour later, after a brief recess. The judge returned, adjusted his glasses, and spoke with deliberate care. In light of the evidence presented, the court grants full legal guardianship to Mr. Henry Thompson. Henry exhaled slowly, a weight lifting off his chest that he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. Lucas ran to him without hesitation and wrapped his arms around his waist. Henry knelt and held him tightly, burying his face in the boy's shoulder. There were no reporters, no press releases, no applause. But in that quiet courtroom, something enormous had changed. On the ride home, Lucas leaned against the car door, eyes fluttering with sleep, one hand still wrapped around Henry's. As they pulled into the garage, Lucas whispered, "We're a real family now, right?" Henry nodded and replied, "We always were. Now the world knows it too." That night, as they sat side by side on the couch, Henry didn't turn on the television or check his phone. He just watched his son trace shapes in the condensation on his glass of juice, thinking about how far they had come in such a short time, and how much further they would go together. The days after the court hearing settled into something soft and steady, like the gentle rhythm of a new melody that both Henry and Lucas were learning together. There was no grand celebration, no fireworks or parties, just quiet understanding, warmth, and a growing sense of belonging that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Henry noticed it first in the small things. Lucas no longer looked over his shoulder before sitting on the couch, no longer hesitated before opening the fridge or turning on the television. He had begun humming under his breath when he played with his toys, leaving his backpack by the front door as if he expected to return every day. And he had started calling Henry Dad, not with the awkward formality of a new word, but with the ease of someone who had decided it was safe to believe. One evening, after dinner, Henry found a worn cardboard box on the shelf in the guest room. Lucas was brushing his teeth when Henry opened it and discovered a handful of drawings, a few paper crafts, and a small journal with crayon-written notes addressed to his mom. He didn't read them all, he felt like an intruder, but he saw enough to understand just how deeply Lucas had loved her. And how alone he must have felt when she was gone. That night, after lights were out and Lucas had crawled into bed with his bear-shaped pillow, Henry sat beside him and asked gently if he ever wanted to talk about her. Lucas was quiet for a while before he whispered, "I miss her every night. But I think she would like that I have someone now." Henry rested a hand over the blanket near Lucas's chest and whispered, "I think she would too." The next day, Lucas brought home a permission slip for a school field trip. It was the first time Henry had seen his name listed under parent or guardian, and he stared at it longer than necessary before signing. It wasn't the paper itself that mattered. It was the fact that the world had begun to recognize what they already knew: they were a family. At school, Lucas started making friends more easily. He had a favorite class now, science, and he proudly told Henry all about caterpillars and magnets and why rainbows happen. Henry listened to every word as if it were gold. He had spent so many years perfecting speeches in boardrooms, but now he understood the power of simply being present, of sitting at a small table and asking, "What was the best part of your day?" On the weekend, they took a trip to the countryside. Just the two of them. Henry packed sandwiches and snacks while Lucas picked out books for the drive. They stopped by a quiet lake, Lucas's choice, and sat together by the water's edge. Lucas skipped stones across the surface, and Henry tried and failed, which made the boy laugh until he was breathless. It was the kind of laughter Henry hadn't known he needed. They lay in the grass afterward, staring at the clouds, and Lucas asked if Henry ever thought about his own dad. Henry admitted he hadn't known him well. "But I hope I'm better than he was," he said softly. Lucas turned to him and replied, "You are. You're my dad now." That night, back at home, they framed one of Lucas's drawings and hung it in the hallway. It was of their trip to the lake, two stick figures under the sun, one tall and one small, holding hands. Above it, in blocky letters, Lucas had written, "Me and Dad." It wasn't perfect. The lines wobbled, the son had a smiley face, and one of the shoes was drawn backwards, but to Henry, it was the most honest and beautiful thing he had ever seen. It wasn't just a drawing. It was a declaration. A memory. A beginning. Henry stood for a long time in that hallway, looking at it. The home that had once been silent and empty now echoed with life. It smelled of soap and crayons and toast. It felt lived in, not polished. And in the middle of it all was a boy who had changed everything without trying, just by meeting someone and giving love in return. Henry realized then that he didn't just want to protect Lucas. He wanted to grow with him. To be the kind of father the boy believed he was already becoming. Months passed, and the rhythm of their new life deepened into something unshakable. Henry no longer saw his days in terms of meetings or stock reports. He woke up to the sound of small feet running across hardwood floors, to the smell of cereal and spilled milk, to the soft murmur of cartoons playing in the background. He no longer felt the need to fill silences with strategy or drown emotion in routine. His schedule was still full, but now it revolved around school drop-offs, science projects, lunchbox notes, and bedtime stories. He still wore suits and took important calls, but the weight of those things had changed. They no longer defined him. Lucas, too, had transformed. The guarded little boy who once flinched at affection now ran into Henry's arms after school. He asked questions without hesitation, laughed without fear, and occasionally demanded pancakes for dinner with the boldness of someone who knew he belonged. He was no longer just a guest in Henry's world, he was the heart of it. They had developed rituals, Saturday morning waffles, evening walks with ice cream even in the cold, spontaneous dance contests in the living room, and whispered conversations in the dark about dreams and memories and things that couldn't be spoken during the day. One evening, as they sat together reading in the soft glow of a bedside lamp, Lucas paused and asked, "Do you think she can see us?" Henry didn't have to ask who he meant. He looked at the boy's face, so open and hopeful, and said, "I think she sees everything. And I think she's proud of you." Lucas nodded, then reached for the framed photo of Sophie on his nightstand and placed it gently next to the drawing he'd made of the two of them. He didn't say anything more, but Henry could feel the quiet peace that settled over him. There was grief there, still, but it no longer owned the space. It lived alongside joy now, and hope. One afternoon, Henry was called to Lucas's school for a parent conference. He expected the usual discussion, academic progress, social adjustment, but the teacher smiled and said, "I just wanted to tell you something." Lucas gave a presentation about his family today. He said, "I found my dad when I wasn't even looking." And he didn't run away. He stayed. The teacher's voice caught slightly. That kind of love, it changes things. For him. For you. For all of us. Henry left the school that day feeling a kind of fullness he hadn't known he'd been missing. He picked up Lucas from class, and they stopped for smoothies on the way home. In the car, Lucas asked, "Can we always be like this?" Henry didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "No matter what." Lucas leaned against him at the red light and said, "I don't remember what it was like before. But I'm glad it changed." That night, Henry stood in the doorway as Lucas slept, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest, the way his fingers curled around the edge of the blanket. He remembered the first time he saw the pendant, the moment that turned his life upside down, and now, looking at this small, beautiful boy who had once been a stranger, he felt nothing but gratitude. Not for his success, or the buildings that bore his name, or the fortune he had built, but for the second chance life had handed him when he least deserved it. For a reason to become more than he ever thought he could be. In the quiet stillness of that room, Henry knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just a story about redemption or unexpected love. It was the beginning of everything. A life reimagined, not by chance, but by choice. And every day after would be written by both of them, together. In my view, the ending of this story is both emotionally satisfying and deeply human. It doesn't rely on dramatic twists or grand gestures, but rather on quiet, authentic transformation. Henry's journey from a cold, driven millionaire to a present, loving father is what makes the story resonate. The real beauty lies in how connection, trust, and healing grow not from wealth or power, but from listening, showing up, and choosing to stay. Lucas's presence becomes a mirror, reflecting what Henry lost, and ultimately what he found again, the capacity to love without condition. It's a reminder that sometimes the most life-changing moments come from the people we never expected, and that redemption is often quiet, slow, and incredibly powerful.